Well, I've been aware, gosh, I suppose from childhood. You know, only children, it must be an absolute catastrophe to run a culture where you had so many only children. And modern life, East and West, has dramatically become this. One or two children, not huge families that there used to be. I mean, the wastage, the death rate was terrible, of course, from birth to young children, disease and malnutrition and ill treatment. I mean, goodness. But there was community, family, relationship. I don't mean good relationship, but at least relationship. Whereas the 21st century majorly faces isolation. You could feel it coming in the 60s of the 20th century. It was heralding this 21st century. You know, a lot of this flower power and New Age movement, I think, was a consequence of not knowing if you belong, not feeling part of, an alienation, an isolation. It's the creeping destruction of society. It's the opposite of society. It's loneliness. And many complications of society. You know, there's an acute problem of how do we harmonize? Our solution has been isolation. We're not a friction to each other, but we're not truly a help either. And everyone seems to be facing the same sort of needs and problems, but without the feeling that the help is there. The ties and the relationships that you would rely on to survive or even not survive, but in some sense together. Look, this sounds an incredibly negative discourse, but I think I'm compelled to look at it because, of course, I've suffered from it from the beginning. A sort of feeling that you don't fit in society. You fit in what society should be, but it's not like that. And this is everyone's problem, on the left or the right, you know, politically speaking. They know the society they would value, but it's evidently not there. When it's said in the Jesus story, I'm come that you might have life, and that the key foundation of it all is that God is your dad. Of course, it assumes that God exists anyway, because it was that sort of society. It's just that it was a society that had, well, a very unloving God in many ways. And the Jesus story attempts to protect, I was going to say protect. It's not protect, is it? It's going to solve that problem. Rescue it. The foundation stone is that God is your dad. That makes you in a family. You're recognizing relationship from the beginning. It might be like a Western dysfunctional family, but it's a family. And we need to make it functional. I don't mean we're moving back to some historicistic ideal of what the family was. Only that the ideal is now that it should be very functional, loving, in other words. In other words, of course, we're assuming that God is the perfect God and all-powerful, and He's Dad, loving God, and our Dad. Not some manager, not some elite power that's ruling the place, a monarch or a bureaucrat, but that the master of it all, God of all, is our Dad, which in perfection means, from our point of view, our notion of perfection means loving and caring of us. In fact, of all, because, well, we wouldn't like to be the one that was not favourite. So I argue He can have no favourites. I impose this on Him, don't I? I impose it on my view of God. But that we are family. And that therefore, in some perfect sense, we should be caring for each other. So we are purposed to do that wherever we can. So when we go to meetings or when we talk to someone in a shop or something, or see someone in need, we follow through on our desire for it to be as it should be. Us helping each other, rescuing, concerned for each other. You see, religion, good religion, ideally, is the blessing of blessings. In practice, it's not been, for a variety of reasons, no doubt. And reasons which, from the individual's point of view, may well be seen as way beyond our control. There's nothing we can do about this Leviathan society that we live in. We've got all sorts of ideas as to how it should be. But it is what it is. And we feel victim of it. And it's not loving. It's not what a perfect God would be doing. From our point of view. So we feel alienated from God and religion, but that's because we don't realize this is not meant to be heaven here. This is the universe, the material universe. It's a very artificial, restricted, strange place called a school. There are powerful forces around which we do not affect the presence of both good and evil as we see it in our lack of understanding, and have to live with as best we can, or die. We have a fear of dying to make sure we stay here. You're meant to have a fear of dying, that you stay at school and don't simply run off truant. You don't commit suicide. You have to not know that heaven exists, or you would commit suicide. Well, assuming you were convinced that having done so, you wouldn't be thrown back into the school immediately. But yet another life. Oh no, not here. You know, the near-death experience people don't want to come back, except for the loving concern of their loved ones, their children, their parents, their friends, those that need them. Typically their immediate family, but you know, there's a great need to get back. But not a desire, well, except to be with them and help them. From a selfish desire, they want to stay in heaven. But they're told categorically, time's not yet. You need more lessons, love. You need to go back. And some of them give every reason in the book as to why they don't want to go back. But of course the ones we hear of are those that do come back, and they're the ones that give way and come back. That's superficially, at least, as we see the story. I seem to have come to a pause. Hang on a minute. The essence of Bob Dylan being the most outstanding poet of the 20th century was his ability to relate to the isolation of youth, especially. Hey, Mr. Tambourine Man, play a song for me. I'm not sleepy and there is no place I'm going to. In the jingle jangle morning, I'll come following you. You know, I'm ready to go anywhere. I have no bearings. I mean, from the Second World War, I was the result of broken marriage relationships. And they come together and by mistake they have Marshall. And there's all sorts of problems for them. And we don't have more children, so Marshall's on his own, coping with a family that are not quietly murdering each other, day in, day out. I'm speaking figuratively, but emotionally I'm speaking very really. It was an age where youth was not fitting, were not part of community, a tribe, a family, but part of a technology that was fast getting out of hand, epitomized by nuclear tests and the potential end of the world. Do you see their public position was screaming at them that society is collapsing. It's the end of the world, epitomized by building up radioactivity in the atmosphere. women protesting, Greenham Common was it called, against nuclear facilities. A desperate bid from women that wanted to truly be mothers and care and do something about the collapse that was beyond anyone's ability to turn and avoid and put right. Interestingly, one of the weapons used against the women was noise. These psychological approaches to controlling your population of disintegrating persons. Look, I'm on a negativity again. I must come to the positive fast. You're at a meeting and you realize more than half the room are elderly, single persons, and their problem, vocalized openly, is isolation. You could say, and they would say, at least we have each other. But it's not enough, of course, because they're all in their separate homes and they're living alone. Oh my God, who can rescue them? You see, we have a materialism and a technology that's given us a mobility of disintegration of relationships. We live in a formal world of contacts according to our material needs, whereas in some historic sense at least, we lived in a community of persons you woke up with and slept with and ate with. So you used to eat together, now you eat alone. This is so for an increasing number of people. And of course in the nuclear family, the two of you, assuming you're still together, eat alone together, assuming you're talking to each other. In my house they weren't. Mum would bang the food down on the table for Dad and go back to the kitchen because there's no way she was going to eat with him. And Marshall didn't know whether it was safe to eat with Dad or not with Mum around. I could go out with Dad shopping. He'd drive and I'd sit next to him. I knew the rules. You don't touch the car. You know, it marks the paint. You don't put your hands on the car. I mean, it's that sort of world you're living in. You could say, goodness, your dad was a tyrant. Yeah, well, he was a bit Victorian. Everything has to be done in the right way, boy. Yes, Dad. And provided you said, yes, Dad, you knew you were quite safe. You get on with him. And he would provide, I mean, buy you an ice cream. He's not unfeeling, for goodness sake. What does he need? What does the boy need? Notice it's the boy. It's not Marshall. It's the boy. You're an object of duty. Thank goodness he had duty, though. Goodness sake. We'd have had nothing otherwise. What a frighteningly warped background you've got, Marshall. Well, yes. Nothing but the grace of God that's had me survive 77 years after that start. But in other ways, it was incredibly privileged, of course. A beautiful, loving mum and a wealthy, very able, determined dad. able in a worldly sense. Well, wealth, I suppose. Yeah. What did Marshall learn from the beginning? Oh, wealth wasn't the answer, nor were good looks, apparently. That's surprising, because Mum was still worshipping Hollywood. And Dad was still, well, very attracted to Mum because she was beautiful. But not beautiful in hating him, of course. Beautiful in loving me, of course. Absolute salvation. What was missing? Oh, from my point of view, the notion of a perfect dad. I don't mean I was looking for such, but I was increasingly realised I was going to become such. And a perfect husband, of course. That was what was needed. I'm going to become that. I'm going to put my family first. I'm not going to seek either wealth, career. I'm not going to put career before my family. And I'm not going to put looks before other things. I'm looking for love and fellowship, not looks. I don't need the best-looking woman in the room. One who loves me is far more valuable. So you could say this catastrophic start was just the right thing for me if one was in a learning situation. And in effect I was. Well, of course, both Mum and Dad had a very objecting view to religion. Both in their way treated it in utter contempt. Almost with Mum, but definitely with Dad. Well, Dad just totally wrote it off and ignored it, because Mum would think, well, I've been to Sunday school, been there, done that, didn't do me any good, you know. I'm sure Jesus was a man that was way before his time, and look what the religion did to him, just had him crucified, you know. Been there, done that, if you were to use a Kiwi jargon on the situation, she'd have been thinking that way. But the essence of the Jesus story, yes, I mean, both would have said, well, yes, we're supposed to do the right thing. And in some sense, the Jesus story enshrines the right thing. The religion's a load of nonsense, but yeah. And isn't that amazing that, in a sense, that's where I've ended up? The religion's not good, but something of the original intention is exactly the answer. God being a kind, loving dad, not a Victorian, tyrannical dad, of course. And my God has to be divine mum as well, because mums symbolise love and care, and that was my rescue. So God has to have these features. He's got to be dad, not Victorian father, but warm and loving dad. And I find, like a friend of mine who is the perfect dad in a way, in his little way. He's got lots of children, and his wife loves him, and she's had all the children. And they're both Christians, sort of, but they don't always end up at church. And they live in chaos. The family well, with a family you're permanently trying to stave them off from dysfunctionality in the modern world. The world seeps in and corrupts, especially if you're seeing it from a religious Christian type point of view. But he's a lovely chap. She's a lovely person too, lovely mum. Wow. I'm pausing again, aren't I? Look, I'm going round the houses. I want to get to the point. The essence of the Jesus story would be invaluable for my isolated friends. But they're alienated from it because of the world they live in and one's objections to Christianity especially too. So we're watching a film which utterly mocks the entire biblical story and Christianity and society and the pathetic notions we have of good and evil, living up to our eyes in this society. And so they're mocking something that actually traces back to the very answer they need, which is if only they could see God, first of all, as existing. I mean, they've killed God, is it Nietzsche's view of things? And that he's also not only existing, but is a loving God, their God, Dad. It's still the case, I think. Am I clutching at straws, you might say? That the Jesus story had it before it got heavily edited and reinterpreted and used, misused, seized by the state and then by the academic world. Our sciences, which had nothing to do with God, although most early scientists believed in some form of God. And strangely enough, if you look at the sciences today, it's the physical sciences, the older ones, that have people still that trust and love God. Their God, of course. Not necessarily a Christian one. Thank goodness. But not necessarily a Jesus one either. And really they'd be so much better, I think, with the Jesus view of God. Not entirely, don't get me wrong. But a loving God. Know what you value, know what you want, and worship that. Your personification of your values is the only God you can love. And isn't it reasonable to include in that he's the sort of character that's as a loving Heavenly Father, a perfect, all-powerful, all-loving Heavenly Dad? How can that be unacceptable to anyone? And okay, if you say it's a gender problem, right, make it perfect, all-powerful, all-loving, divine mother. Or better still, just friend, neutral, forget the issue. Who cares about gender? It's irrelevant. I'm dealing with people, souls, something eternal, ideally in my mind. Not male, not female, but the best of both, yes, certainly. I sit there in the room of these generally older folk, and I hear their cry in a sense. I know their situation because I'm 77 and I live alone, basically. I've got good friends, but I live alone. It's not clear any of these friends could come to my rescue if I'm truly in need. I don't discard them and not call them friends accordingly. You may say because he's got nothing else. That would be a sad comment to make there. I'm not making that. No. Their need calls on my heart. Why? Because I know how they feel. And if I didn't have you, Heavenly Dad, well, I wouldn't be here. It's as simple as that. My life would have dissolved in despair long, long ago. And it was like that for the first 24 or 5 years of my life, and not instantly vanishing afterwards either, I might point out. It takes time. It took time for me anyway. I mean, I've seen conversions that are far more dramatic than mine, and I felt mine was dramatic. Well, it was for me. You know, you've seen what we characterize as arch criminals becoming angels overnight. And I've seen this. Fantastic. Fantastic turnaround. Something happened to them that utterly transformed them. Well, it's not that dramatic for most of us. And it's much more drawn out. We're here for a long time. As Eastern folk would have it, we come back millions of times in order to get it right. But you don't have to. You could do it in the blink of an eye. In certain circumstances. Fascinating. Well, I've rambled on for half an hour, but I do seem to have got there. And if you're not sure whether I've got there or not, it might help to listen to this again. Bless you. Bless you. Thank you, Heavenly Dad.